I woke up to the cool metal of the bench beneath me and the hum of a distant train bringing me back to reality. I had no idea how I had ended up at the train station, let alone at this station. The name of the town Maplewood seemed painfully familiar to me, like a word on the tip of my tongue. The echoes of a half-forgotten life tugged at the edges of my consciousness, pulling me to a place I had long forgotten. 6 months had passed since I lost my memory after a terrible accident. Doctors said it was a miracle that I survived at all, although sometimes I felt like I was still in the wreckage. I was drifting downstream like a ship without a compass, and only fragments of my former life slipped through the cracks of my consciousness. The town was quiet, almost too quiet for the afternoon. I walked down the main street, the sun casting long shadows as it began to set. Storefronts with names like Maplewood Grocery and Smith's Pharmacy lined the street, and their familiarity gnawed at me. I passed a small park, and the sight of a rusty swing set triggered a flash of recognition, a blurry image of a woman pushing a child, her laughter ringing like a long-forgotten tune. Instinctively, I headed toward the police station, whose red brick facade stood at the end of the street. Something about this place seemed right, like a piece of a puzzle had fallen into place. Inside, I was greeted by the familiar smell of old wood and coffee grounds. The sergeant on duty looked up, his eyes narrowing as he recognized me. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice gruff but curious. I think I used to work here," I said, the words sounding foreign but undeniable. "I was a detective." His eyes widened slightly. "You're Richard Dawson, aren't you? I thought you were dead." The name, my name, it fit like an old coat. "I don't remember much. I was in an accident." The sergeant nodded slowly and then invited me to follow him into a small, cluttered office. "There was an accident, yes, but some people here don't believe it was an accident." I sat down across from him, the dim light of the room casting long shadows. "What do you mean?" He sighed, rubbing his temple. "Your wife, Mary, she was involved. There were rumors, dark rumors. You were investigating something big. Then you disappeared. And Mary..." He stopped talking, but I understood enough. My heart pounded as memories began to flicker. The arguments for life, the premonitions, Mary's face etched with a mixture of fear and determination. "Where is she now?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "Still in town," he replied. "She lives on Elm Street." The address resonated in me like a lighthouse calling me home. I left the station, dizzy, the pieces of my broken past slowly aligning. As I walked to Vyazov Street, the air became thick with anticipation and fear. The house stood at the end of the street, a modest 2-story building with ivy creeping up its walls. I hesitated at the gate. Memories flashed through my mind. Laughter, quarrels, love gone bad. Taking a deep breath, I stepped forward and knocked on the door. A moment later it opened, and there she was. Maria. Her appearance pierced my memory like a lightning bolt. Pictures flashed through my mind, the day of our wedding, the late nights spent studying the case files, the accident. "Richard?" Her voice was trembling, her eyes wide with shock. "It's me," I managed to say, although my voice was choked with emotion. Tears appeared in her eyes. I thought you were gone forever." We stood there, the weight of the years pressing down on us. When I went inside, the floodgates opened. Images of our life together, of love and betrayal, flashed before me. The accident, the investigation, and the dark, shadowy figures that seemed to linger just out of sight. "I need to know the truth," I said, my voice resolute despite the chaos inside. Mary nodded, her face pale. "There are things you need to remember, Richard. Things I can't explain." With those words, the real journey began. A journey back into the shadows of our past, where secrets and horrors were waiting to be revealed. Mary led me to the living room, the familiar yet forgotten space triggering a cascade of memories. I remembered the soft blue of the walls, the worn leather of the sofa where we had shared countless moments, some happy, some tense. The air felt heavy with unspoken words and unresolved conflict. She sat across from me, her hands nervously twisting the edge of her shirt. "I don't even know where to start," she admitted, her voice trembling. "Start with the accident," I urged, leaning forward. "What happened that night?" She took a deep breath, her eyes locking onto mine. "You were investigating a series of disappearances. Women from this town, gone without a trace. You were convinced it was something unnatural." "Unnatural," I echoed, confusion mingling with a sense of dread. She nodded. "You spoke of shadows, figures that moved in the darkness. At first, I thought it was the stress getting to you. But then, I started seeing them too." A chill ran down my spine as fragmented memories surfaced. Figures lurking at the edge of my vision, whispers in the night, a growing paranoia that had consumed my every thought. "That night, you told me you had found something," she continued. "You were frantic, said we had to leave town. But then, the accident." "What about the accident?" I pressed, the need for answers burning within me. "We were driving out of town when the car swerved off the road. I don't remember much after that, just waking up in the hospital." She looked away, tears brimming in her eyes. "They said you were gone. I thought I'd lost you." "But it wasn't an accident, was it?" I said, piecing together the fragments of our conversation. She shook her head. "I don't think so. You were getting too close to something, and someone wanted to stop you." The room felt suffocating as I grappled with the enormity of what she was saying. My accident had been orchestrated, and my memory loss wasn't just a tragic consequence. It was deliberate. "I need to remember," I said, determination hardening my voice. "I need to know what I was investigating, who was behind it." Mary hesitated, then reached into a drawer and pulled out a worn, leather-bound journal. "You kept this with you all the time," she said, handing it to me. "Maybe it can help." I took the journal, its weight both familiar and foreign in my hands. As I opened it, the pages were filled with my handwriting, notes, sketches, frantic scrawls detailing my investigation. The disappearances, the shadows, the feeling of being watched. Flashes of memory hit me with each page I turned. A woman named Evelyn, last seen near the old factory. A sketch of a dark figure, all sharp angles and piercing eyes. My own fear, palpable in the shaky lines of my writing. "I remember Evelyn," I said, the name sparking a clearer image. "She was one of the first to disappear. I talked to her family, but they didn't know much." Mary nodded. "You were convinced she had been taken by them." "The shadows," I murmured, the word feeling strange on my tongue. She leaned in, her expression intense. "Richard, these weren't just disappearances. People said they saw things. Figures in the dark, eyes watching from the shadows. You believed it was something ancient, something that had been in this town for a long time." My mind whirled with half-formed memories and the growing sense of something dark and malevolent lurking just out of sight. The pieces were starting to fit together, but there were still gaps, still shadows hiding the full truth. "I need to go back to where it started," I said, closing the journal. "I need to retrace my steps, see if I can remember more." Mary's face paled, but she nodded. "Be careful, Richard. Whatever it is, it hasn't gone away." I stood, the journal clutched tightly in my hand, and made my way to the door. The night was falling, casting long shadows across the town. As I stepped outside, the air seemed to hum with a latent energy, as if the very town was holding its breath. I had a direction now, a path to follow. The old factory, where Evelyn had last been seen, was my first stop. As I walked through the darkening streets, memories flickered like old film reels, snapshots of a life I was only beginning to remember. The factory loomed ahead, a hulking silhouette against the twilight sky. I paused at the entrance, the heavy iron gates creaking in the wind. My heart pounded as I stepped inside, the past and present converging in a single terrifying moment. The shadows were waiting, and I was ready to confront them. The old factory stood like a monument to forgotten times, its broken windows and rusted metal echoing with memories of the past. I pushed open the creaking gates, the sound piercing the eerie silence. Mary was beside me, her presence both comforting and disconcerting. "Are you sure about this?" she asked, her voice wavering. "This place, it holds too many bad memories." I glanced at her, her face pale in the dim light. "I need to know the truth, Mary. I can't just walk away." She sighed, her shoulders sagging. "I understand, but, Richard, some things are better left buried." We entered the factory, the air thick with dust and decay. The memories came flooding back, the smell of the machinery, the echo of footsteps on the concrete floor. I led us deeper into the labyrinth of rusted equipment and broken walls, the journal clutched tightly in my hand. Mary stayed close, her eyes darting around nervously. She looked perfect, as always, her beauty untouched by the years and the darkness that had enveloped our lives. It was a stark contrast to my own disheveled appearance, the lines of stress and time etched deeply into my face. "Remember when we first met?" she said suddenly, her voice a soft whisper. "You were so different then, so full of life and ambition." A smile tugged at my lips despite the tension. "Yeah, I remember. You were the one who kept me grounded, kept me from flying off the handle every time I got too caught up in a case." She laughed softly, the sound a balm to my troubled mind. "I had to. You were always so passionate, so driven. But you also had a temper, Richard. You let things get to you too easily." Her words struck a chord. She was right. I did have a temper. I had always been the one to push too hard, to dig too deep. It was a flaw that had served me well in my career, but had often caused friction in our marriage. We stopped in front of a large metal door, its paint peeling and rust streaking its surface. "This is where I found the first clue," I said, my voice barely more than a whisper. "Evelyn's scarf. It was here." Mary's face tightened, her eyes filling with a mix of fear and sorrow. "Richard, please, let's go. This place, it's dangerous." I turned to her, frustration bubbling up. "You know something, don't you? Something you're not telling me." She looked away, her hands twisting together. I can't, Richard. It's too dangerous." "Dangerous? For who? For us? For you?" The words came out harsher than I intended, my temper flaring. "For everyone," she said, her voice breaking. "You don't understand. There's so much more at play here than you realize." Her fear was palpable, but so was my need for answers. "Then help me understand. Tell me what you know." Tears welled up in her eyes. "I can't. If I do, they'll come for us. They'll make sure we disappear too." "Who? Who are they?" I demanded, stepping closer, my frustration mounting. She shook her head, her tears spilling over. "Please, Richard, just let it go. For us, for our safety." Her plea tore at my heart, but my need for the truth was stronger. "I can't, Mary. I have to see this through." Her face crumpled, and she turned away, hugging herself tightly. "You're going to get yourself killed." The words hung in the air, a stark reminder of the stakes. But my resolve hardened. "I have to do this," I said, softer now. "For Evelyn, for the others, for us." She didn't respond, her silence a heavy weight between us. We stood there, two broken souls in the heart of a forgotten place, the shadows of our past threatening to engulf us. As we delved deeper into the factory, I couldn't shake the feeling that Mary was hiding something significant. Her reluctance, her fear, they were clues to a larger puzzle. I just had to figure out how they fit. We reached an old office, the door hanging off its hinges. Inside, a desk lay overturned, papers scattered across the floor. I knelt down, sifting through the debris, hoping to find something, anything that could shed light on my investigation. Mary stood at the doorway, her arms wrapped around herself. "You were always so stubborn," she said quietly. "It's one of the things I loved about you, but it also scared me. I paused, looking up at her. Scared you? Why? Because you never knew when to stop. You'd push and push, no matter the cost. Her words stung because they were true. I had always been relentless, often at the expense of those I loved. I'm sorry, I said, the weight of my flaws pressing down on me. I never wanted to hurt you. She smiled sadly. I know, but sometimes loving someone means knowing when to let go. Her words hung in the air as I found an old photograph amidst the clutter. It was of Evelyn, smiling brightly, her eyes full of life. My heart clenched as I remembered her family, their pain, their loss. I have to do this, I repeated, more to myself than to her. Mary sighed, her shoulders sagging. Then let me help you. We need to do this together. The resolve in her voice surprised me, and I nodded. Together. As we left the office, a new determination fueled my steps. Mary was right. We needed to face this together. Whatever darkness lay ahead, we would confront it side by side. And maybe, just maybe, we could find the answers we both so desperately needed. The next few days were a blur of investigation and tentative reconciliation. Mary and I worked together, combing through old notes, revisiting places from the case. Each discovery brought more questions than answers, and the shadows of doubt grew longer. One evening, as we sat at the dining table surrounded by papers and photographs, Mary broke the silence. Richard, what if we just left? We could start over somewhere far away from here. I looked at her, the weariness evident in her eyes. You know I can't do that. Not until I figure this out. She sighed, frustration flickering across her face. I just want us to be safe, to be happy again. Her plea tugged at my heart, but the drive for the truth was an unrelenting force within me. I know, Mary, but I can't let this go. She nodded, resignation in her eyes. Then we need to be careful. If what you suspect is true, then we're dealing with something very dangerous. Our investigation led us to the town archives, a dusty, forgotten corner of the library filled with old records and forgotten histories. We spent hours poring over documents, looking for any connections between the missing women and the shadowy figures I had seen. Look at this, Mary said, pulling out an old newspaper article. There was a similar series of disappearances back in the 1950s. Same patterns, same lack of evidence. I read the article, my mind racing. It's like history is repeating itself. But why? She shook her head. I don't know. But maybe if we find out what happened then, it could help us understand what's happening now. We left the archives as the sun began to set, the sky painted in hues of orange and pink. The sense of unease that had settled over me since my return intensified. As we walked home, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. That night, as I lay in bed beside Mary, my mind churned with the pieces of the puzzle we had uncovered. I had always trusted my instincts, but now, everything felt murky and uncertain. The woman I loved was hiding something, and the shadows of our past were closing in. The next morning, Mary suggested we visit an old friend of mine, Samuel, who had retired from the force a few years ago. He had been my mentor, a grizzled detective with a knack for uncovering the truth. If anyone could help us, it would be him. Samuel lived in a small cabin on the outskirts of town, a secluded spot surrounded by dense woods. As we approached, the memories of our conversations and late-night stakeouts flooded back. He had always been a rock, a steady hand guiding me through the chaos. He greeted us with a warm smile, his eyes twinkling with curiosity. Richard, Mary, it's been too long. Come in, come in. We sat in his cozy living room, the scent of fresh coffee filling the air. It's good to see you, Sam, I said, a genuine smile breaking through my exhaustion. He looked at me closely, his expression turning serious. I've heard about your accident, and now you're back, digging into old cases. What's going on, Richard? I filled him in on everything, the disappearances, the shadows, the memories that were slowly resurfacing. He listened intently, nodding occasionally, his brow furrowing deeper with each revelation. I remember those disappearances, he said finally. Strange cases. No evidence, no leads. It was like the women just vanished into thin air. Do you think it's happening again? I asked, the desperation clear in my voice. He leaned back, his eyes narrowing. It could be. But if it is, you're dealing with something much bigger than just a few missing persons. There's a pattern here, a connection that we missed back then. Can you help us? Mary asked, her voice soft but insistent. Samuel looked at her, then back at me. I'll do what I can, but you need to be careful. There are forces at play here that you don't understand. As we left Samuel's cabin, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. But beneath it all, a nagging doubt gnawed at me. Mary had been so eager for Samuel's help, so insistent on involving him. Was it genuine concern, or was she trying to steer me away from something? That night, as I pored over my notes, a thought struck me. Mary had always been perfect, too perfect. In the back of my mind, doubts and suspicions began to form. What if her involvement was not just supportive but also manipulative? I decided to test my theory. The next morning, I suggested visiting another old contact, a journalist who had covered the original disappearances. Mary hesitated, then quickly agreed, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. We met the journalist, a wiry man named David, in a small cafe. He was eager to help, pulling out old notes and clippings he had saved. This was one of the strangest stories I ever covered, he said, spreading the documents across the table. There were always rumors of something more, something sinister. As he talked, I watched Mary closely. She seemed genuinely interested, asking questions and taking notes. But there was a tension in her posture, a slight rigidity that set my instincts on edge. After our meeting, as we walked back to our car, I confronted her. Mary, are you hiding something from me? She stopped, her eyes wide with shock. What? No, Richard. Why would you think that? Because you seem so eager to help, yet you keep urging me to drop the case. It doesn't add up. Tears welled in her eyes. I'm scared, Richard. I don't want to lose you again. I just want us to be safe. Her words were like a dagger to my heart, but the doubt remained. I need to know the truth, Mary. No more secrets. She nodded, wiping her tears. Okay, no more secrets. I promise. But as we drove home, the seeds of doubt had taken root. I couldn't shake the feeling that Mary was playing a deeper game, one that I was only beginning to understand. The truth was out there, tangled in the web of our past, and I was determined to unravel it, no matter the cost. The drive back from the cafe was shrouded in an uneasy silence. Mary's earlier promise of no more secrets lingered in the air, but doubt gnawed at me. The night had descended by the time we reached our home, and a thick fog rolled in, cloaking the town in an otherworldly gloom. As we stepped inside, the house felt different, colder, darker. A sense of foreboding settled over me. I shook it off, attributing it to my growing paranoia. But then I saw it, a shadow flitting past the window, quick and silent, like a whisper in the dark. Did you see that? I asked, my voice low, trying to keep the rising fear at bay. Mary turned, her eyes wide. See what? Someone's outside, I said, moving toward the window. But when I peered out, the fog had thickened, obscuring everything beyond a few feet. I could feel the hair on the back of my neck standing up, my instincts screaming that something was wrong. Mary came up behind me, placing a hand on my arm. It's probably just the fog playing tricks on you, she said, her voice soothing. Come on, let's get some rest. I nodded, though my mind was far from at ease. As we prepared for bed, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The darkness outside seemed to press against the windows, heavy and malevolent. Sleep was elusive. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, my thoughts a tangled mess. Around midnight, I heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible whisper. I sat up, straining to hear, but the room was silent. I glanced over at Mary, who was sound asleep, her breathing steady and peaceful. I got up and walked to the window, peering out into the impenetrable fog. The whisper came again, clearer this time, though I couldn't make out the words. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, echoing in the stillness of the night. A shiver ran down my spine. I turned back to the room, but something stopped me. A figure standing in the corner, barely visible in the dim light. My heart raced as I tried to focus, but the figure seemed to dissolve into the shadows. I blinked, and it was gone. My rational mind screamed it was just a trick of the light, but deep down, I knew there was more to it. Something, or someone, was trying to get into my head, to make me question my sanity. I returned to bed, my heart pounding. As I lay down, the whispers grew louder, forming words that sent chills through me. Leave. Now. Before it's too late. I sat up abruptly, my breath coming in ragged gasps. Mary stirred beside me, waking up. Richard? What's wrong? I shook my head, not trusting myself to speak. The whispers had faded, but the fear lingered. Nothing. Just a bad dream, I managed to say. She frowned, worry etched on her face. Are you sure you're okay? I forced a smile. Yeah, just need some fresh air. I left the bedroom, needing to clear my head. As I walked through the darkened house, the sense of being watched returned, stronger than before. I reached the kitchen and turned on the light, hoping to dispel the shadows clinging to my thoughts. But the light flickered, casting eerie shapes on the walls. I felt a presence behind me and spun around, but there was nothing there. Just my own reflection in the window, distorted by the fog outside. I leaned against the counter, my mind racing. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to come together, but the picture they formed was terrifying. The disappearances, the shadows, the whispers, they were all connected. And Mary, perfect as she seemed, was at the heart of it. As I stood there, I remembered something Samuel had said. There are forces at play here that you don't understand. I needed answers, and I needed them now. I grabbed the journal and my coat, heading out into the night. The fog swallowed me as soon as I stepped outside, the cold air biting at my skin. I walked through the silent streets, every rustle and creak amplified by the fog. My destination was the old factory, where this all began. If there were answers to be found, they would be there. The factory loomed ahead, a dark silhouette against the night sky. I pushed open the creaking gate and stepped inside. The air was thick with dust and the scent of decay. I moved cautiously, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the darkness. As I made my way deeper into the factory, the whispers returned, growing louder and more insistent. They seemed to be leading me, guiding me to something. My heart pounded in my chest as I followed them, every instinct screaming at me to turn back. But I couldn't. I had to know the truth. The whispers led me to an old office, the door hanging off its hinges. Inside, the room was a mess of papers and broken furniture. I scanned the room, my flashlight catching on something shiny. A small, ornate box half hidden under a pile of rubble. I reached for it, my hands trembling. As soon as I touched the box, the whispers stopped. The silence was deafening, pressing down on me like a physical weight. I opened the box and found a series of photographs. Women, their faces filled with fear and desperation. Among them was a picture of Mary, her eyes wide with terror. My blood ran cold. The box slipped from my hands, the photographs scattering across the floor. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. Mary wasn't just involved. She was a victim, trapped in this nightmare with me. As I stood there, the shadows in the room seemed to come alive, closing in around me. The whispers returned, louder and more insistent, filling my head with a cacophony of voices. Leave. Now. Before it's too late. But I couldn't leave. Not now. Not when I was so close to the truth. I gathered the photographs and shoved them into my pocket, my mind racing. I needed to confront Mary, to understand her role in all of this. I stumbled out of the factory, the fog wrapping around me like a shroud. The journey home was a blur, the whispers following me every step of the way. By the time I reached our house, I was shaking, my mind a whirlwind of fear and determination. I burst through the door, my heart pounding. "Mary!" She appeared at the top of the stairs, her face pale and drawn. "Richard, what's wrong?" I held up the photographs, my hand trembling. "Explain these." Her eyes widened as she saw the pictures. "Richard, I can... explain!" I shouted, the desperation in my voice unmistakable. She took a step back, tears streaming down her face. "I tried to protect you. I tried to keep you safe. From what? From who?" "Them," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "The shadows. They take what they want, and they don't let go." Her words sent chills down my spine. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because I knew you wouldn't stop. I knew you'd keep digging until they came for you too." I stared at her, the weight of her words sinking in. She had been trying to protect me, even as she was trapped in this nightmare herself. But it was too late for protection. The shadows were closing in, and there was no turning back. "Mary, we need to fight this. Together." She shook her head, fear etched in every line of her face. "It's too late, Richard. They're already here." As if on cue, the whispers grew louder, the shadows in the room deepening. I turned, my heart hammering in my chest as the dark figures began to emerge from the corners of the room. The truth was out, and the nightmare had only just begun. The shadows crept closer, their dark forms twisting and writhing like smoke in the dim light. Mary grabbed my hand, her grip tight with fear. "We need to go now," she said urgently. I didn't hesitate. We bolted out of the house, the whispers growing into a cacophony of malevolent voices. The fog outside was thicker than ever, but we pushed through it, running blindly into the night. We didn't stop until we reached the old church on the outskirts of town, its crumbling facade offering a semblance of sanctuary. We slipped inside, our breaths coming in ragged gasps, the heavy wooden door closing behind us with a resounding thud. I turned to Mary, my mind reeling. "You need to tell me everything, now." She nodded, her face pale in the faint light filtering through the stained glass windows. "The shadows, they're not just figments of our imagination. They're real, Richard. They're ancient entities, drawn to places of suffering and despair." "Entities?" I echoed, trying to wrap my mind around her words. "Yes, they feed on fear and pain. They've been here for centuries, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. The disappearances, the whispers, everything. It's all connected to them." I leaned against a pew, the weight of her revelation pressing down on me. "But why us? Why now?" Mary's eyes were filled with a mix of fear and guilt. "Because of me. I tried to protect you, to keep you away from this. But they sensed your determination, your drive to uncover the truth. It made you a target." I shook my head, struggling to process it all. "So what do we do now? How do we stop them?" "We can't fight them directly," she said, her voice trembling. "But there are ways to weaken them, to push them back." "How?" I demanded, desperation creeping into my voice. She took a deep breath, her hands shaking. "There are old rituals, ancient symbols that can repel them. We need to find those symbols and perform the rituals." I nodded, a spark of hope igniting within me. "Where do we start?" Mary hesitated, then pulled out a small, weathered book from her coat pocket. "I found this in the town archives. It mentions the rituals and the symbols. We need to gather the materials and find a place to perform the ritual." I took the book from her, flipping through its yellowed pages. The text was filled with strange symbols and instructions, written in a language I didn't recognize. But Mary seemed to understand, pointing out the key passages. "We need salt, candles, and something personal from each of the victims," she explained. "The ritual needs to be performed at midnight, at a place of power, like the old factory." "The factory?" I asked, my mind flashing back to the eerie, decaying building. She nodded. "It's where their presence is strongest. If we can weaken them there, we might be able to drive them away for good." As we gathered the materials, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The shadows were still out there, lurking in the fog, waiting for their chance to strike. But now, armed with knowledge and determination, we had a plan. We returned to the factory just before midnight, the building looming ominously in the darkness. The air was thick with anticipation as we set up the ritual, the flickering candlelight casting long shadows on the walls. Mary placed the personal items, a locket, a scarf, a small stuffed animal, in the center of the circle we had drawn on the floor. She sprinkled salt around the perimeter, murmuring incantations under her breath. As the clock struck midnight, we began the ritual. The air grew colder, the whispers more insistent. The shadows seemed to close in, their forms growing more defined, more menacing. "Hold my hand," Mary instructed, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. I took her hand, the connection grounding me as we chanted the words from the book. The candles flickered wildly, the flame casting eerie shapes on the walls. The shadows recoiled, their whispers turning into anguished wails. The temperature dropped further, our breath visible in the frigid air. The shadows writhed, their forms dissipating like smoke caught in a strong wind. The personal items in the circle began to glow faintly, their light growing stronger with each passing moment. Suddenly, the whispers ceased, replaced by a deafening silence. The shadows dissolved, leaving only the dim light of the candles and the chill of the night. We had done it. We had pushed them back. Mary slumped against me, exhausted. "It's not over," she whispered. "This is just the beginning. We need to stay vigilant. They'll come back, stronger than before." I nodded, my resolve hardening. We'll be ready. Together. As we left the factory, the fog began to lift, revealing the first light of dawn. The battle was far from over, but for the first time in a long while, I felt a glimmer of hope. We had faced the darkness and survived. Now, we just had to find a way to end it for good. And as we walked back to our home, hand in hand, I knew that no matter what lay ahead, we would face it together. The shadows might be relentless, but so were we. And in the end, that determination would be our greatest weapon. The dawn brought a brief respite, but the weight of what lay ahead pressed down on us. We returned home, exhausted, but determined. The ritual had given us a temporary victory, but Mary was right. The shadows would return, and we needed to be prepared. We spent the morning gathering more supplies and studying the ancient book. Its pages were filled with cryptic symbols and archaic language, but Mary seemed to understand it better with each passing hour. She explained that the rituals were part of an old tradition, passed down through generations to protect against the very entities we were facing. As we worked, I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that there was something Mary still wasn't telling me. The way she had found the book, her knowledge of the rituals, it all seemed too convenient. But I pushed the doubts aside, focusing on the task at hand. There would be time for questions later. By afternoon, we had everything we needed for the next ritual. Our plan was to reinforce the protective barriers around our home, to create a safe haven where the shadows couldn't reach us. As we prepared, the air grew heavy with anticipation, the sense of impending danger never far from my mind. Just as we were about to start, the phone rang, its sharp tone cutting through the silence. I answered, my heart pounding. "Hello?" "Richard, it's Samuel. I think I found something." Samuel's voice was urgent, filled with a mix of excitement and fear. "What is it?" I asked, glancing at Mary. "There's an old legend about a hidden place in the woods, a sanctuary where the shadows can't reach. If we can find it, it might be the key to stopping them for good." A sanctuary. The word filled me with hope. "Where is it?" "I'm not sure, but there are clues in the town archives. Meet me there in an hour." I hung up, turning to Mary. "Samuel thinks there's a sanctuary in the woods, a place where the shadows can't reach. We need to find it." Her face paled, but she nodded. "Let's go." We arrived at the town archives to find Samuel already there, surrounded by old maps and documents. He looked up as we entered, his eyes bright with determination. "I think I've found it," he said, pointing to an old map of the area. "There's a clearing deep in the woods, marked with ancient symbols. It matches the descriptions in the legends." Mary studied the map, her brow furrowing. "But it's miles from here. We can't get there before nightfall." "We'll have to risk it," I said, my resolve firm. "This might be our only chance." We gathered our supplies and set off into the woods, the daylight already starting to wane. The trees loomed overhead, their branches twisting like skeletal fingers against the sky. The path was treacherous, overgrown with underbrush and hidden roots. But we pressed on, driven by the urgency of our mission. As we ventured deeper, the forest grew darker, the air colder. The whispers began to return, faint at first, but growing louder with each step. I tightened my grip on the book, the symbols on its cover seeming to pulse with a life of their own. "We're close," Samuel said, his voice barely more than a whisper. "The clearing should be just ahead." We pushed through the last of the underbrush and emerged into a wide, open space. The clearing was eerily quiet, the air heavy with a sense of ancient power. In the center stood a stone altar, covered in moss and etched with the same symbols from the book. "This is it," Mary said, her voice trembling with a mix of fear and awe. "The sanctuary." We approached the altar, the whispers growing louder, more insistent. I opened the book, finding the page with the ritual we needed. "Let's do this." As we began the ritual, the air grew colder, the shadows at the edge of the clearing seeming to writhe and pulse. The symbols on the altar glowed faintly, responding to our chants. The whispers turned into a cacophony of voices, rising to a fever pitch, and then, with a sudden burst of light, the shadows recoiled, their forms dissolving into the air. The clearing was filled with a blinding radiance, and for a moment it felt as though the world had stopped. When the light faded, the whispers were gone. The air was still and silent. The oppressive weight lifted. We had done it. We had found the sanctuary and performed the ritual. But as I turned to Mary, I saw a look of profound sorrow in her eyes. "What's wrong?" I asked, my voice tinged with fear. She shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "I'm so sorry, Richard. There's something I haven't told you." My heart sank. "What is it?" She took a deep breath, her voice trembling. "The shadows. They're not just drawn to suffering. They're drawn to me. I made a pact with them years ago before we met. I thought I could control it, but I was wrong. They've been following me ever since, feeding on the fear and pain I caused." The ground seemed to shift beneath my feet. "Why didn't you tell me?" "I was scared," she whispered. "Scared of losing you, scared of what you'd think. I thought I could keep you safe, but I only made things worse." The truth hit me like a punch to the gut. Mary had been at the center of this nightmare all along. Her perfect exterior, her knowledge of the rituals. It was all part of a desperate attempt to atone for her past. "We can fix this," I said, my voice shaking with emotion. "We'll find a way to break the pact, to free you from them." She looked at me with a mixture of hope and despair. "I don't know if it's possible, Richard, but I'll try. For you." As we left the sanctuary, the shadows of the past still loomed over us. But now, we had a new mission, a way to break the cycle of fear and pain. The journey ahead would be fraught with danger, but we would face it together. And in the end, that was all that mattered. The sanctuary provided us a brief respite, but the realization that Mary was the key to the shadow's presence weighed heavily on my mind. The rituals had weakened them, but not destroyed them. As we returned to the house, the weight of our next steps pressed down on us. Mary and I sat in the living room, the ancient book open on the table between us. Samuel had gone to gather more supplies, leaving us alone to face the grim reality of what needed to be done. "There's a way to break the pact," Mary said, her voice soft but resolute. "But it requires a great sacrifice." I looked at her, fear and determination battling within me. "What kind of sacrifice?" She took a deep breath, her eyes meeting mine. My life. If I die, the shadows will be banished. But there's also a way to weaken them without killing me. If we can transfer the pact to an object and destroy it. My heart ached at the thought of losing her. We'll find that way, Mary. I won't let you die. She smiled sadly. Richard, it's not that simple. The shadows have kept me young for years. If we succeed, I'll age rapidly. But I'd rather grow old with you than continue like this. I grasped her hands, the determination in her eyes giving me strength. Then we'll do it. We'll find a way to break the pact and save you. Samuel returned with the supplies, his face grim. I found something, he said, placing an old weathered scroll on the table. It's a ritual to transfer the pact to an object, but it's dangerous. We need to be prepared for anything. We gathered everything we needed and made our way back to the sanctuary. The forest seemed even darker, the shadows pressing in on us as if aware of our intentions. We reached the clearing and began the ritual, the ancient words resonating in the still air. As we chanted, the shadows grew agitated, their forms shifting and writhing. The air grew colder, the whispers turning into an angry roar. The object we had chosen, a small, ornate mirror, glowed with a malevolent light as the pact began to transfer. Suddenly, the shadows surged forward, their dark forms converging on us. Samuel stepped forward, raising his hands to hold them back. "Finish the ritual!" he shouted, his voice strained. Mary and I continued chanting, our voices rising above the chaos. The shadows recoiled, their forms growing fainter, but they fought back with a vengeance. Samuel cried out as they overwhelmed him, his body falling to the ground. "Samuel!" I shouted, but Mary pulled me back, her grip firm. "We can't stop now," she said, her voice filled with determination. With one final surge of energy, we completed the ritual. The mirror shattered, the pieces glowing with a blinding light. The shadows let out a deafening scream, their forms dissolving into the air. The light faded, leaving the clearing in silence. I turned to Mary, fear gripping my heart. She stood there, her face pale, but alive. "It worked," she whispered, relief and exhaustion in her voice. But as the moments passed, I saw the changes. Her hair turned silver, her skin wrinkling with age. The years the shadows had stolen from her were returning all at once. Tears filled my eyes as I held her close, the reality of our victory bittersweet. "We did it," she said softly, her voice weak. "Yes, we did," I replied, my voice choked with emotion. "But at what cost?" We buried Samuel in the sanctuary, his sacrifice a reminder of the cost of our victory. As the days passed, Mary grew weaker, the toll of the years too much for her body to bear. Despite my efforts to save her, she knew her time was running out. One night, as I sat by her bedside, she took my hand, her grip surprisingly strong. "Richard, promise me you'll live. Promise me you'll carry on." Tears streamed down my face as I nodded. "I promise, Mary. I promise." With a final, peaceful smile, she closed her eyes, her breath leaving her in a soft sigh. The love of my life, my partner in the battle against the shadows, was gone. In the end, we had won. The shadows were banished, and the town was safe. But the cost had been high. Samuel's sacrifice, Mary's life, these were the prices we paid for victory. As I stood by her grave, the sun rising in the sky, I knew I would carry their memory with me always. The shadows were gone, but the love and sacrifice of those who fought against them would never be forgotten. And as I walked away, I felt a sense of peace, knowing that Mary's spirit would always be with me, guiding me through the rest of my days.